last week in Virginia. But I got in Saturday.
Yeah, there's so many. Always, right?
How are we looking there, sir?
Well, I guess I was going to try to figure out actually how to.
Are the charts already?
There should be on here, but
Okay.
this is a PC.
Escape.
There we go. Okay. I hate using PCs.
Oh, so did they load
It should be loaded in somewhere.
So that's AM. So let's see if we can go to PM.
Yeah, they should all be there.
Power. All right, good.
That up.
I may just open them all.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Len. By the way, I'm not good at PCs either, but I haven't seen. Are you Paul?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't remember exactly what you looked like, but
I was the
it's been
guy
a few
on
months.
on the side over there making negative comments.
No, not at all. I'm so glad you were able to make it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate that. I didn't. Let's see. How many slides you got? Did you follow the?
17.
Perfect. You get the whole hour then.
Crispy.
Oh, good. Perfect. And I assume you're going to talk, hey, we have some terrestrial technologies, and they could be adapted for things like the moon, and here's some of the advances we're doing, and
That kind of
there
thing.
could be commonality. Okay, perfect.
I think some of that will come out during the Q&A as well.
Yeah. All right, there's So, and you're the final guy, the anchorman. Is that good?
Fine, that's fine. Yeah, anywhere you want this one.
Two of the last one.
I'm just going to get the PowerPoint. So now I have, I think, 4 PowerPoints.
Is there a reason there's two different ones there?
Because I think he had a PDF too.
Oh, okay.
So I want to get rid of the ones that aren't mine.
Oh, off the.
All right, so there's Len, there's Paul, Eric, and Bob. All right, I think I can handle this. So basically all I'm going to do is introduce the 4. I don't know exactly what your title is.
Program director. It's on the slides. Yeah.
Energy type stuff?
Yeah, I've done everything in energy storage more or less.
Energy
It's not
storage.
totally true, but yeah, energy storage.
Because in the program it does say energy storage by your name. But
That's
are
fine.
you going to show anything from Rachel?
No, I'm not. I have not.
You can maybe mention that you also have a nuclear.
I didn't really prep that enough to say too much in touch. I think also all that is like 10 megawatts in the
Yeah, but there's some technologies again that could translate. Because I'm actually going to her kickoff meeting in December. Yeah.
You may know more about it than I do, actually.
Well, yeah, I don't want to be the one representing it though, for sure. So I was just going to introduce the 4 and then let them go through their slides and then open it up for questions.
Yeah, I'll introduce you.
Okay. Yeah. And I've told them 7 minutes. No, I've told them 5 minutes, meaning that they'll probably take 7. And if 4 takes 7, that's 28 minutes.
I'll be like to that. That's
4?
you might take it.
Take 5 to 7.
Yeah, we have 1 to 2 for this part, and then we'll take a break. And then we have
Okay. Now, we were at a restaurant, and there was just the restaurant is full of attendees. So
yeah, we'll have to see. We'll start as close as we can, even if
you might want to give 5 minutes or 10
we'll give it
minutes.
2 minutes because we knew that was a problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, then we'll take a break.
Okay.
And the focus is not just the small robotic.
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're going to talk.
We didn't get into that as much this morning as maybe we can. A little bit toward bigger scale.
But I think most of these folks are SMB folks. So
Especially in this case.
RPG.
We'll see how it goes.
Well, I'll try and keep it
I think the
balanced.
audience sort of brought it around to that as well.
Bring up
We'll probably bring it up.
Okay.
Glenn's.
It's just 1. It's not even 1 o'clock.
Now, I may have deleted the agenda. I don't know whether you wanted that up. Not deleted it, but closed
It off. Well, we'll get it.
Hey, you're in line right after. Let's see if we can organize.
Wherever you want.
I'm back.
Yeah. So basically, I'm going to introduce you guys. I'm going to give you a team in your Unless you, what would you prefer? I want a microphone. That's what we want. It's off from the microphone. We'll just hands down the line. And I am prepared. So be succinct with your points. But I mean, the point is, we really want to know about audience. Seem good? We still want to say a little about
I'm talking about yeah, I was going to say
Oh, I did, yeah. Oh, that next row.
Working from my house. Okay. To build we actually filled the fans as break. I'd love to show you getting cooling on and getting handling the shutdown. There's kind of a cooling in for boost or primary cooling because we are not yet ready for primary flow, but that first 5 minutes and the last 2 days, makes the world a lot better. And so we're demonstrating NASA says the limit on our technology is 25 length. 40. Just look, I don't want to argue with Dr. Jerry Brown. He's a very fabulous, smart guy, and I have a world of admiration. But he made that proposition 15 years ago. I don't fully know all of his constrained assumptions. So it's, Jerry Brown knows more about electric motors and systems soul finger than I will in my body. But he has to go back and revisit some of his assumptions. He says 40 and I say 40 are good. He doesn't work for it, but it's, we're working on this whole idea. And, I think it's really interesting for enabling similar surface areas. Solar. Probably as easy as anything else. But for an engine, you're going to have it's on the electric power rig. You could use if you were clever,
He's going to ask me if you had any presentation.
you might be able to circulate.
I didn't know how you
get a cold radiator.
Okay. Mad scientist look? A little bit, yeah. I did hear that. I was outside. I don't see him now. Unfortunately, the sales guy, I go everywhere. Should be able to help. Yeah, so maybe I could do it then. If I can get Chris to log in. I was going to take out the hook. It's going to be the slow trip.
Yeah, I know. Manny was. I don't think so.
Yeah, those late lunch people.
I don't know what. I think we're ready to get started for the afternoon. If people want to take their seats. We're just waiting for you.
Oh, thanks. You can start now.
Okay, this afternoon we have two panels dealing with technology. The first one is on power. The second one will be on thermal management. And so we'll take about an hour for the first one, and then we have a break, and then we'll come back for the thermal management. So I'd like to introduce Lee Mason, who many of you are familiar with from his work on power. And Lee will introduce the panel, and we'll start the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you all for getting back from lunch on time. Appreciate that. We have a very fun-packed panel here with a lot of smart people that can talk about power technologies. I'm going to go through the list real quick. First is Len Dudzinski. He's a program executive in the Science Mission Directorate, overseeing the radioisotope power systems program. We have Bob Sievers from Teledyne Energy Systems. He's a director for advanced power systems there, and also responsible for work going on in fuel cells and the MMRTG. So we'll hear directly from the supplier of the MMRTG. Next to him is Eric Brandon. He's a group supervisor at JPL in their battery department, and he'll talk about advanced batteries that might apply to this mission application. And I think he's also going to tell us a little bit about some of the deep space battery technologies that JPL has been working that might serve a purpose here. And then finally, we have a terrestrial representative on our panel, Paul Albertus from ARPA-E. He's a program director at ARPA-E, developing especially energy storage technologies. And so maybe he'll mention some analogies of terrestrial technology that could apply to the lunar mission. So without further ado, I'm going to get started here with Len. And they all have a few slides that they're going to brief, like 4 or 5 slides. The format will be for them to go through all their slides, and then we'll open it up for audience participation. So I'm hoping the first half hour is presentation, the second half hour is Q&A. So Len, go ahead, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lee. So as Lee mentioned, I'm the program executive in the Planetary Science Division, program executive for the Radioisotope Power Systems Program, which was instituted in 2008, primarily to ensure the availability of radioisotope power for NASA's missions. That includes both the capabilities to fly radioisotope power systems, the systems themselves, and the plutonium fuel to provide the heat for them. We could have the next slide, please. So using radioisotope power, the United States since 1961 has been able to fly 27 missions using 46 radioisotope thermal generators of various designs. We've been able to, because of radioisotope power, NASA's been able to explore the deep recesses of the solar system where photovoltaic power is impractical. Basically, the dark regions of the solar system for extended periods where we need to operate. Certainly, the moon and the surviving lunar night can be characterized as that kind of condition challenge. Long duration photovoltaic power is impractical. Next slide, please. Lunar surface has been a beneficiary. Exploration of the lunar surface has been a beneficiary of radioisotope power in the past. We flew on the six RTGs on the Apollo missions. The first one being an RHU on Apollo 11. The other missions carried an RTG that powered the LSEP science payloads, and because of the RTG, as we heard this morning, those science payloads were able to operate through many lunar nights many years after their emplacement. In this image here, we're seeing an Apollo astronaut actually loading plutonium into the RTG, which sits on the surface of the moon already. The plutonium in that time period was carried separately from the power conversion and loaded on the surface. It's not how we operate them now, but it was a successful operating model in the past. Next slide. So right now, in terms of capabilities that we have to offer for both science and human exploration on the moon, as well as potential commercial use, we have two system capabilities. One for heat, that being the radioisotope heater unit, uses about 1 watt thermal, about the size of a 35mm film canister. We've flown literally hundreds of these in past missions. We right now have about 43 available, and working with the Department of Energy, we are developing, reacquiring the production capacity to make radioisotope heater units again to supply them to future NASA missions and other missions as needed. We're also flying right now on the surface of Mars the multi-mission radioisotope thermoelectric generator. Produces about 110 watts electric. It has a 17-year lifetime using 2,000 watts thermal of plutonium heat. The first one flew on the Curiosity rover, still operating. In fact, I'd like to say because of the MMRTG, Curiosity survived the Martian night, the long dust storm that we recently had passed through and cleared. The other rovers, solar power rovers, didn't fare so well, but Curiosity is still alive and in fact operated during that time period. So MMRTG is a very successful capability and the one that we intend to maintain and continue to offer for other missions, including lunar surface missions. One of the activities of the Radioisotope Power Systems program is to continue to invest in new capabilities and technologies to enable them. We're investing in a number of different power conversion technologies to make future RPS systems more efficient, both dynamic power in the form of Stirling and Brayton power conversion, which we're doing a technology maturation effort on right now, as well as more efficient thermoelectric power conversion like on the MMRTG, where we hope to perhaps enhance the MMRTG performance, or we are about to embark on the development, release an RFP for the development of the next generation RTG, which could provide up to 500 watts electric power in the modular form. Those next generation RTGs could be broken into smaller modules to provide perhaps a few tens of watts up to the 500 watts for whatever mission operations we would need on the surface of the moon. Again, 17-year lifetime, perhaps more than what we would need, but on the surface of the moon, but it's there if we need it. Next slide, Lee. Often questions that we get asked about how much plutonium we have and whether we could really seriously consider plutonium as a heat source for exploration. One of the accomplishments of the Radioisotope Power Systems program over the last 10 years is to work with the Department of Energy again to reacquire the capability to produce new plutonium-238 in this country, something that we hadn't had since 1988 until about 2 or 3 years ago when we started producing the first few hundred grams of plutonium again. We've been working with the Department of Energy to develop new capabilities to more efficiently manage our infrastructure at the Department of Energy, as well as manage our plutonium throughput. And this, just the key takeaway for you all on this slide is that the orange bars represent our predictions of new fuel-clad assemblies of plutonium-238 over time. The blue bars represent our drawdown, or the blue bars represent 15 fuel-clad assemblies. And we see the drawdowns and NASA's plans over time. But the key takeaway is that our availability is robust. We believe we will have plutonium-238 to support exploration of both the moon and hopefully eventually Mars. So it's something we can very seriously consider. As we talk about new efficiencies in radioisotope power, one of the things we're concerned about is which could be scaled up to about 10 kilowatts of electrical power, and that 10 kilopower system could provide power for human exploration of the moon and eventually on Mars in a very similar design. So we like to tout the fact that what we do on the moon just a key takeaway for you all is that NASA is studying kilopower for applications on the surface of the moon. We heard interest this morning in being able to not only provide power but also mobile power and the ability to move.
Are what is flying now. There are, show a few of the systems here for historical reasons. There is the GPHS RTG that flew on Cassini, Galileo. We then developed the MMRTG, multi-mission RTG, in the early 2000s. We developed that system for both planetary operation as well as planetary surface operation as well as deep space. When we moved from the GPHS RTG to the MMRTG, we certainly did take a hit on power density or specific power and the power levels, but it also filled a need for surface operations and deep space in a single generator. We are, as Lee mentioned, we're developing an enhanced MMRTG, which has a little bit superior performance relative to MM. And then you also mentioned next-gen RTG that has a significant advancement in the performance using some of the advanced thermoelectric materials. There's been a lot of good thermoelectric material development going on around the country, but also at JPL. JPL has done a lot of nice work in the thermoelectric area. So really the state of the art right now is the MMRTG. It's flying the block upgrade, let's say, is the enhanced MMRTG, and it gives us a little bit more capability. It's the next gen that will offer us superior efficiency and superior weight. It is just in terms of where the technology stands, where the gaps or the maturation challenges. Certainly there's a heritage silicon germanium capability still in existence. We could still make silicon germanium. But there would be a penalty, not a penalty, but there's some gaps there. One is that it's got limited efficiency. It's not as efficient as the newer materials. And we'd also have to do some system development around it. So we'd have to go from an 18 GPHS to a 16 GPHS system, and there would be design work to build that in. We'd also have to put the new silicon germanium capabilities back in place. They're not there at the moment. The other area of sort of a gap or where you need to mature the technology, I mentioned advanced on electric materials. This is scudrudite, this is lanthanum telluride and sintal. These have been put into couples and tested at a component power level, but it really needs system development and system maturation. And that's one of the things that NASA is going to be funding over the next year or so. Now let's go back to slide number 1.
Okay.
So RTGs, this has got incredible energy density, right? It's got very long life, puts out power for a very long time. Sort of the next step down is sort of regen fuel cells. So regen fuel cells can make sense to store energy for both Martian and lunar operations. Let me tell you a little bit about how it works. Basically, you're going to use solar power during the day to run an electrolysis stack, produce hydrogen and oxygen that go into storage. When you need power, the fuel cell makes power, whether it's day or night, and also gives you waste heat. So if you've got a cold lunar night, that waste heat actually has some advantages. Water goes back into storage, and the water and reactants just move around the cycle. One embodiment is shown there in the middle of the view graph. This is a Martian surface concept. The 1 kilowatt, the 10 kilowatt system is to scale relative to the astronaut. But for a lunar system, you really need a lot more reactant storage, a lot more water storage than is depicted in that figure. And in fact, you really need something on the order of storage of 2,000 kilograms of reactants and water. So now you're looking for ways to use the lunar lander or other large structure to be a reactant and water storage system. This is certainly doable, and if you can take advantage of the storage on a lander, for example, you're talking about a 10 kilowatt system that's got that's specific energy of about 850 watt hours per kilogram. So that's pretty impressive. The fuel cells themselves and the electrolysis stacks, electrolysis systems are well-developed technologies for other applications, but they need to be adapted for these applications. There would be issues, some tech maturation needs that would come up. For example, the tanks that you're going to store the reactants in, can you use the lander's tanks? Is that feasible? Can you store water? Can you deal with the potential for water and reactant losses? Are you beeping me?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard you.
Not me, man.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think I talked that long. So, and then of course, then you put the system together and you've got to demonstrate the overall life and reliability. These are, but they're not intractable. There's a very attractive technology for something like a lunar night. Go to the next slide. There's just a comparison slide of sort of looking at how the time of how long you're going to need to provide power in the dark versus the power level you want, and sort of up in the upper right-hand corner is where you see the regen fuel cells having a figure of merit better than a battery does. When you get down to the lower power levels or shorter durations, batteries make more sense. Go to the next one.
It's your RTG one.
Oh, okay, go to the next one. And for some reason, Lee wanted me to comment on what the industry perspective is, so I just threw some bullets up here. Certainly going to the moon, the pivot to the moon makes sense to us. It seems to really take advantage of more of the industry's capabilities, being able to go to the moon. It's less of a technology stretch. It employs more of what we can bring to the party. Power and energy is still enabling, so you really need to look at that and what it's capable of doing for you, on these missions. Certainly, NASA engaging industry early and at a certain level really helps us maintain our infrastructure. So we develop talents, like at Teledyne we've developed skills for doing fuel cells. If I don't get enough investment in other places or from NASA, that skill set goes away. And those are the kind of things that industry has to kind of worry about, both the infrastructure and the skill sets. So sustainment of funding for key technologies is important. The ability to be flexible on key requirements or on requirements, maintain key requirements but be flexible on others, lets industry do a better job of meeting cost and schedule, and get you an earlier system deployment. And speaking of system deployments, certainly when you can deploy systems or technologies early, where you've compromised perhaps on power level, lifetime, weight, gets equipment, gets systems out there and burns down your risks and other issues that sort of are barriers to deploying technologies. And as we move to these new missions, having trade studies that look at how do you compare battery systems, RPSs, kilopowers, and RFCs. Where does the trade space take you? And so that industry can then plug in and say, here's where I can help develop something, because it's attractive. And I had one colleague that really wants more time on the ISS. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Bob. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Eric Brandon from JPL.
Okay, you go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of our thoughts on batteries. So it's important to realize that now, as I say here, most of the NASA missions do require batteries. If you look historically at our missions, in the very earliest days, going back to 1958, our first satellite Explorer 1, in that year we used primary batteries only. As you went into the 70s and 80s, some of our missions, the human missions, tended to focus on fuel cells. A lot of our deep space missions used RTGs only, for example, Galileo, Cassini, and so on, and really didn't use battery technology because a lot of the technology really wasn't there. We had silver zinc, which worked great on some of our Lunar missions, and we heard about that earlier today. We also used some NiCad, but really the long-term reliability didn't come into the battery realm until I would say the 90s and beyond, when we started getting robust lithium-ion technology available. And that's really when it took off. And now, like I said, you'd be hard-pressed to find a NASA mission that didn't involve some type of battery. And here I just sort of gave you a gallery of different types of batteries that we deal with in various deep space missions, Earth orbiting missions right now. You can see examples of the MSL battery, the Mars Science Laboratory battery. It uses the prismatic lithium-ion cells that you see technology we developed in parallel with them using custom electrolytes. We have thermal batteries that are used for very high power events, such as entry, descent, and landing, as we use on most of our Mars missions today. You can also see some of the primary battery technologies using ultra-low temperature technologies, the DS2, which was a microprobe on the failed Mars polar lander, which was again meant to be a penetrator. Those can operate down to -80 degrees C. And you can see examples of the low temperature cylindrical cells that we've also developed with industry, where we use sort of industrial-based lithium-ion combined with customized electrolyte technology. So you can see, again, thermal batteries, primary batteries, rechargeable, a lot of different technologies that we use. And as I indicate there, what are the main uses? Sometimes it's a primary power source. Sometimes it's to support load leveling, where the eclipses or night or roll is today.
Welcome to Ring Central Meet.
So if you go to the next slide, So this just gives you, for those of you that don't live and breathe batteries every day like we do, just give you a quick primer. Remember, the batteries are really comprised of three technologies. What we always first start out with is the cell level. And you add more cells to increase voltage, you add more cells in parallel to, in series to increase voltage, more cells in parallel to increase capacity. And it's a pretty simple equation. There's two main types of lithium-ion type cells, which is, again, is the main rechargeable technology we use today. There's the large prismatic cells, which you see examples of, that usually tend to focus on the higher capacity side of things, 100 amp hours or more typically. And then the small cylindrical cells, which really form the basis of most of our current batteries today. It's much smaller capacity, but really gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of the design of your battery packs. Also allows you to put more, let's say, inherent safety features and fault-tolerant features into your battery pack that really provide for a more robust design of the battery pack. And then there's also primary cells. Those are typically a D cell, just the same kind of D cell that you might buy at a grocery store, but with advanced, say, electrode and electrolyte technologies inside the cells themselves. Those can be on the order of 10 to 20 amp hours in capacity, and use a variety of different chemistries that can operate over a fairly wide temperature range. So really, those are the main types of cells that we have to construct battery packs from. So if you go to the next slide, you know, almost on a weekly basis, my group, the Electrochemical Technologies group at JPL, are asked either by a pre-project or a concept study, maybe a full-fledged mission. We have requirements X, Y, Z. Tell me what kind of battery we should use. So we go through that kind of sizing exercise, selection exercise all the time. And as you saw, we have a lot of different choices to choose from, essentially, from those different kinds of batteries. It could be lithium-ion with different chemistries inside of it. They could be primary with different chemistries. Sometimes we do hybrid packs. We might look at, for example, combining lithium-ion for high energy combined with supercapacitors for high power. So you can get a wider range of performance. But after a while, after doing this for many years and getting sort of what I call half-baked requirements up front, we tend to hone in on just sort of some critical system-level questions that we always ask that are very applicable to these applications and this application set that we're talking about today. You know, first and foremost, what loads are involved and what power levels are required. You know, are these relatively high constant power, low constant power, high peak power? How much energy is required per cycle? That's particularly important if you have a day-night cycle or if you have an eclipse. And so that tells us how we can size the battery. And do we need high specific energy to meet the mission needs based on a mass constraint, for example? What is the operating environment? Is it low temperature? Is it high temperature, high radiation, high impact? All of those things can impact the selection of the chemistry. And then really, very importantly, what options are available for thermal management, okay? And so in the case of a low temperature performance, it might be, do we have heaters? Do we have radioisotope available to provide heat? Are we on our own and basically have to take care of the battery without those existing options? And in some cases, we have to worry about high temperature resilience, even on the moon, for example. Do we have radiators? Do we have louvers to radiate the heat away? And as we heard about this morning with some of the lunar applications, there's a lot of very elegant thermal designs using mylar blanketing, radiators, heat phase change materials, and all of those things are available to us to help manage the temperatures on battery. So those are the kind of key questions that we always ask when we're asked to sort of select and size a battery technology. So my final slide here, the next one, I'll show you just sort of what we sort of represent as a way of thinking about this problem and breaking it down into sort of three different bins. And I start out with the first one is missions where adequate thermal management is really available. That one might be an example where we already have an RTG on board, such as MSL, so that's great. We have 100 watts of electrical power, we also have thousands of watts of thermal power, let's take advantage of that. So even though we're in a relatively low temperature environment, we already have a lot of heat available to us, so we can use a lot of commercially available technologies with that heat available. Another idea is using avionics waste heat that might be available, or even using chemistries that inherently produce a lot of heat as they discharge. And one example I show here is a Europa lander, which we're working on as a concept, which involves essentially using primary batteries only, which, despite the fact that it's minus 180 degrees Celsius on the surface of Europa, we need actually very little additional heating. Because of the waste heat generated by the avionics vault, combined with the chemistry which we use, which is lithium CFX primary cells, we actually get enough heat without even having to have a radioisotope heat source or significant resistive heaters. So in this kind of bin of applications, high specific energy, long life really takes precedence in selecting the battery. If you go to sort of the middle bin, which I say missions where wider operating temperatures can provide system benefits. So it maybe isn't critical, but it can bring significant system benefits. For example, if you look at Huygens probe on Titan, those use, I think, 35 RHUs to keep warm, but they also use a lithium sulfur dioxide primary battery, which has a very wide operating temperature. So with a combination of wide operating temperature batteries and RHUs, you can meet the system requirements. Another example is the InSight lander. So hopefully we'll all be hearing good things about that in 2 weeks as it makes its way to Mars and lands successfully. And so in that case, we had a battery, we did system trades early on and saw that the battery temperatures, the allowable flight temperatures were driving, of the batteries were driving the thermal design. So we used this as an opportunity to insert a new electrolyte into the lithium-ion batteries, which extended the operating range of the batteries and provided immediate system benefits in terms of lower energy consumption for heaters. So we could have done the mission without it, but in the end, having that advanced chemistry gave us system-level benefits. And in this case, I say that it's really the electrolytes have a very significant impact on that system, on the battery performance. So that was an example where we were able to use a technology we've developed over many years, infuse it into a battery, working very closely with a vendor, and getting it into a mission. And the final example, which I'll close with, is missions where wide temperature operation of the batteries is critical. These tend to be small. We heard about a little bit today about distributed missions, small missions. These tend to be what I call augmentations oftentimes to larger missions, maybe flagship missions, where we have very little mass, very small volume budgets, and really little room for heaters. RHUs are maybe cost prohibitive because it's a relatively low cost mission. For example, I showed you the DS2 impactor, which I talked about earlier. We have very small rover systems that we're developing at JPL. One is called Puffer, which is a pop-up rover, which folks are looking at for exploring cavernous regions on Mars and perhaps the Moon. And then you see an example of an orbiting sphere. This is for the Mars sample return. This would actually have the samples from Mars in it, which would return back to Earth. There's a requirement that it operates down, the batteries operate down to minus 80 degrees C. So in these cases, we have very little choice. We really have to look at technologies that go beyond what is commercially available. And as you see on the bottom, as you kind of move to the one side, really there's decreasing thermal management options and requiring increasing battery customization. So that's why even if you're in a, what I call extreme environment, you really always have to step back and look at the system first of all and see what you're given before you jump to a conclusion of exactly what is needed in terms of a battery technology. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you very much, Eric. So our last speaker is Paul Albertus from ARPA-E.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you for the invitation. I think I might be the only terrestrial imposter here today, so looking forward to sharing a few thoughts with you. Let me just make a few brief comments about ARPA-E for folks who are not aware of the agency. So ARPA-E is an agency, a funding agency in the Department of Energy, modeled after DARPA. Three main areas that it focuses on: reductions in energy-related emissions, improving energy efficiency, and reducing energy-related inputs. And really, that pretty much covers all areas of technology almost. So it's a very broad technology focus. The agency has an annual budget of roughly $350 million per year. It's also unique in that there's really no roadmap at ARPA-E. So the people who are at the agency at any one time define what programs get run and what technologies get worked on. I want to just maybe mention a few areas that we've done quite a bit of work in. Energy storage has been one of the big themes that ARPA-E has worked on over its approximately 10-year existence. And within energy storage, there's really two major areas. The first one is in high energy batteries that are focused on, historically mostly on transportation, although there's starting to be some folks in the agency interested in high energy batteries for aeronautics as well, so for airplanes, especially short distance airplanes. There's also been a big focus on stationary energy storage through the years. And between those two, about $400 million of total investment have gone in. So that's kind of a rough magnitude of what RP has funded so far. And within those areas, there's probably a couple of potential touch points to space missions. There's been quite a bit of work on solid state batteries, and also some work on gas electrolyte batteries, which I was talking to Eric about, the little spin-out company that RP has invested in that might have some relevance. So in particular, those kind of technologies are relevant for extreme thermal environments and also potentially with enhanced safety benefits, which then plays into system design. There's also been some work and recent focus on a nuclear fission program called Meitner, focused in particular on modular approaches and factory-built nuclear systems as opposed to the large systems that are out there today, which are more or less bespoke. And so if you get a new kind of cost trajectory around a modular factory-based system. So that's just a couple of examples that there might be a few touch points on. I wanted to share a little bit more detail on one program in particular that we've talked to the folks at NASA about a bit and has some potential relevance here. The next slide, please. And click through, I've got a few click-throughs here. I think there's 3 clicks. You can put it all up. So one of the motivating factors for RPE's interest in long-duration storage, which in this case is defined as between 10 and 100 hours, which is certainly not long enough for a lunar night, but at least compared to what's out there today when people talk about energy storage, this will be long. One of the big driving forces is the simple fact that variable output wind and solar are now really the cheapest form of new electrical generation going forward. This is a historic shift that happened in the last few years. This will be true for probably decades. If you want just electrical energy, the cheapest way to get it today is new electrical energy would be with wind or solar. That's true even in the area of cheap natural gas. It's still cheaper to get electrical energy from wind or solar for a new build. So this is really a big historic change that's taking place. And of course, these resources are variable, and so that motivates an interest in energy storage that would be relevant across a variety of different time scales. And this figure here shows some of the kinds of technologies that would be relevant as you build a large electricity grid with increasing fractions of annual energy coming from wind and solar. And in particular, kind of right now, we're in the kind of 20, up to maybe 50%. A state like Texas might actually hit 50% of its instantaneous energy coming from wind, even last year, for example. But of course, on an annual basis, that's different. And so there's a variety of technologies that you can use, and of course, this ramping thermal generators is a big one. As you move toward 60, 70s, 80% of annual energy from wind or solar, like a variable resource, that's when you start to look at different kinds of approaches. And certainly there's also a seasonal and even an inter-year, inter-decade kind of pattern that's relevant as well. And so next go through. Myself and some colleagues at RB recently put together a program called the DAYS program. About 10 projects in total, about $30 million total investment. These projects are starting basically now, in the next few months, focused on this blue region that I showed here, rough durations between 10 and 100 hours at rated power. And the last slide. This shows you just a very simple and basic overview of some of the technologies that we'll be exploring. I'm showing here the duration at rated power on the y-axis, and on the x-axis here is power output. And really the incumbent for grid technology today, in terms of installations, is certainly with lithium-ion technology, in terms of what's going in right now. And the DAYS program in particular focused on technologies like flow batteries, mechanical systems, or thermal systems that have a relaxed constraint around round trip efficiency. So you really, as you go out toward longer durations, the round trip efficiency is not quite as important. And so there's an opportunity to explore some new technologies and new approaches in these 3 areas in particular within DAYS. RB and others, of course, too, have also done a lot of work around chemical storage, and certainly that would be relevant for things like regenerative fuel cells, And so that's certainly an area of focus as well, but DAYS in particular is focused on these 3 technology categories. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so maybe we can give all our panelists a hand for their... So my goal was to have 30 minutes for Q&A, and I have, I believe, 20 because we started 10 minutes late. So please come up to the microphone if you have questions. I'm going to ask the first one so you guys can get comfortable walking up to the microphone. The first question I'll ask is, you know, NASA is seriously considering going back to the moon in the early 2020s, landing on the surface with potentially a goal of having these landers survive the night. Do we have solutions in hand now to allow that to happen? What are the current state-of-the-art that we could fly today to allow landers to survive the night?
So I mentioned the current capabilities that the radioisotope power system provides, and that being the MMRTG and the radioisotope heater unit. So both of those could provide heat and electricity for lunar night operations in the early 2020s. We have the capability to make new units. We're developing a new capability to make RHUs, and I think that that would be well in line for the early 2020s. And moving forward, I think we would want to build enhanced systems as well as new capabilities that could probably be online as early as 2024, 2025 to support operations moving beyond that. So I would agree that I think we do have capabilities in hand to enable surviving the lunar night.
Any other panelists want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a variety of options. A lot of it's going to depend on what the power levels are and how many nights you want to survive through, right? So, for example, if you look at just on the one end, we do have primary battery technologies that can provide you significant power and I'd say a reasonable mass package for a month. And so that would get you through 1 or 2 nights. If you go the next step, you need something rechargeable. Again, it would depend on sort of what else is available. Would you be, you know, if RHUs are available, it provides a lot more option. If you have only solar only, for example, then you just have to size your battery accordingly and use the heat appropriately. We actually looked at some trade studies like that to support aspects of a lunar geophysical network, and so I know that we've done trade studies like that. You typically, I think you would go into an operational mode in the nighttime, which is lower, and we talked about that idea of survivability versus actually operating. So if you're willing to look at your concept of operations and construct a mission around the technology, I think there's a lot of options. It really depends on what flexibility you have at the system level.
So one of the things that is sort of underlying this as well is what are you going to start out at? What power levels are you going to start out at? Are you going to start out wanting 10 kilowatts, or are you going to start out wanting 50 watts, 100 watts, a kilowatt? And so where we start out at is going to depend or determine how quickly we get there.
It more likely is the power technology that will determine where we start out.
Okay.
So you guys might be the driving force behind how much power these landers could supply during the night.
So seeing an early deployment, for example, of a kilopower system, would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think that's going to be ready in 2021 now. So.
Come on.
We have a first question asker. Go ahead, John.
John Bruner from the Johnson Space Center. For over a decade now, we've been hearing about NASA pursuing public-private partnerships, and they're getting more and varied. And this summer, when we were doing the kilopower compass run at Glenn, one of the discussions that came up was, what if NASA, we always talk about the commercial types providing power and utilities and communication. Well, nuclear materials are pretty regulated. So what if NASA provided the power in a public-private partnership, and then the commercials provided the landers and the mobile explorers that would then tap off that government-provided power, and then NASA would also provide the science instruments. So I'd hope some of you headquartered manager types might start thinking about in those terms, so that we can get to the moon with instead of just relying on the commercials for all these things. Maybe we provide some of the services that enable the commercial guys to do what they really want to do.
Len, you're the only headquarters manager type.
Is there a question in there or just a comment?
Some idea that maybe a public-private partnership would have us providing the power for them.
Sure, and I certainly think that's in the cards. Right now, there's nothing that we're doing in our plans that would prohibit NASA from providing radioisotope power or fission power for that matter as it comes online in sort of a partnership arrangement like that.
Hey, Paul, could you comment on how ARPA-E does public-private partnerships, and if there's a mechanism there that could benefit maybe perhaps NASA missions?
Probably the scale of what RB does is a few orders different than this. So the largest project that RB's ever done is $10 million. So that might be a little bit different order of magnitude here. So yeah, mostly RB funds universities and small businesses and some large businesses for research projects. And interestingly enough, in our statutory language, it says that RB could do essentially demonstration projects and much larger things, but today we really haven't done that.
Thanks. Next question.
Vince from Offline Research. And Bob, you mentioned 200 kilograms of water approximately for power supply.
I mentioned 2,000 kilograms of reactants. It's either in hydrogen and oxygen or it's in water.
So my question is, that's a lot of weight. So if you're going to do this on the moon, in our experiments with lunar polar ices, we learned that first or even second generation refining units on the moon may not be able to purify water, certainly not to the level of humans drinking, but I imagine there might be an issue with power supply with the power units. So what I'm wondering is, if you could just notionally, how tolerant are your systems to contaminants in the water for electrolysis? And do you have some specifications that us and other people working on this should be working on?
Well, I can certainly, I can get that information for you, but there certainly are purity requirements for electrolysis and fuel cells, especially the PEM, proton exchange membrane fuel cell systems.
Yeah, I'm interested specifically not only in the contamination levels, but what types of contamination, hydrogen, sulfides, and that sort of.
Yeah, metals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see Ian's chomping at the bit to answer that question too. No?
We'll get him up there at the microphone. Come on.
Oh, Jerry's much better at talking about that than I am.
I doubt that. Well, I mean, in terms of...
You got to get to a microphone, Jerry.
Come on, Jerry.
Don't be shy.
Well, there's two ways of attacking that problem. One is trying to get as clean a water as possible through different various ways. We know from processing lunar soils and Mars soils, at least the regular ones, what type of contaminants exist and different methods. At the same time, we are looking at making PEM electrolyzers more tolerant to different potential contaminants. So for example, there's work at the Glenn Research Center looking at some of the contaminants that we've considered in the past, hydrogen sulfide, hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid type of things, and seeing how much of that can we allow and to stay in the system. We're also looking at solid oxide electrolyzers as a possibility instead of PEM electrolyzers for different applications. So to a certain extent, you know, water purity is one way of going, and we distill water on space station in 0G to a certain extent to run it through PEM electrolyzers. So that technology can exist. The other is, if I want to go for long periods of time, how do I make my current technologies more resistant or more acceptable? So.
And those are good points. Unfortunately, the ISS electrolyzers don't start with lunar-derived ice.
No, but they actually come from probably a dirtier, you know, humans feedstock. So
there's also a corollary to that. Before, it looks like you have another follow-up, but you know, also the idea of utilizing propellant-grade, you know, fuels for fuel cells, hydrogen and oxygen from the propulsion system is a possibility that we're going to think about. Go ahead.
Yeah, just I was concerned mostly about, say, the first couple of missions, keeping that cost down by having contamination tolerant systems, but also having workable ices. I would argue which one is more unacceptable, human originated water or lunar polarized water, because they're both kind of.
Okay, next question.
Sam Clark, JPL. So I hope you guys are going to be here for the thermal panel, because one might argue on the moon that thermal management and technology associated with thermal design are also highly significant, maybe as significant, in some instances, maybe more significant for power technology.
Well, we have a whole session devoted to thermal, so let's not bring in thermal yet. That's next session.
Well, I was going to ask if any of these people would comment on thermal management as part of what they're proposing for the power system, batteries or RTGs or the fuel cells, how important thermal management was to design. Yes, we could wait and discuss all these things during the thermal panel session.
No. Anybody want to talk about their thermal management needs?
Well, from the thermal management point of view, RTGs, of course, have got their own heat. Right. They don't care what the temperature is outside, but it's how you use that heat, right? So exactly. Can you use the heat to keep the batteries warm like we do on Curiosity?
Or can you use something rather than heaters? Can you use the instruments? Duty cycles can play a role in it.
Yeah, and I hope that's what I highlighted in the final slide that I had. I mean, that's our very first question whenever we do a system trade is what available thermal management is there? Is there an RTG? What type of waste heat is available from avionics? Does the battery chemistry lend itself? So that's usually the number one question we ask, and then we can work around that. And so, yeah, we view them as really, I'd say, in many ways, one and the same. They're very integral to each other.
Next question.
Yeah. Power levels. I participated in Desert Rats for at least a couple of years. And we very specifically, we carry the recharging system to recharge the SCV. They change the acronym every now and then. But in charging that one, it was 16 kilowatts minimum for a human rover, which was the SCV, and that was probably only about 75% of what would really be on the moon. When we're talking about power, if we're ever talking about humans on the moon, we're talking about a minimum. We need 100 kilowatts. We need 70, we need hundreds and hundreds of kilowatts. And I'm not hearing a whole lot. Even in Desert Rats, they talk about, oh yeah, we're doing all this simulation, and then they have 4 100 kilowatt generators there that run the site. Instead of, really looking at the power, and I've always seen NASA plans underestimate the amount of power we need for surface operations, whether it be Moon or Mars, and if you're doing ISRU, up that by another order of magnitude. So what do you guys, because I looked at your presentations, all of them are more in the low power regimes. How much are you guys, who are the professionals in the area, pushing the power guys to push for these higher power levels, which we have to have?
Come on, Len, you could do it.
So one of the things that I would say initially is that I didn't present the power architecture, I presented a series of capabilities, but one of the things that we have in mind is the idea that you could take multiples of a 10 kilowatt kilopower system and put them outside of a base in order to provide 10, 40, even 100. You can imagine there might be a practical limit to how many of these units before we want to go to a larger size, but we have in mind that we could get to perhaps 50, 100 kilowatts of electric power using a scaled up kilopower design. We also have in mind that we could provide radioisotope power for various operations that could be a couple kilowatts or larger, depending upon how much plutonium-238 you want to use. And building on that is the idea that we want to use what heat we have very efficiently. So the dynamic power conversion, I think, the technologies play into this equation, that we can make maximum electricity from a limited amount of thermal energy. But multiples of tens of kilowatts, if not 100 kilowatts, is certainly where we get to sustained human presence, and building on our initial outpost, we're going to need 100 kilowatts, and I think nuclear power is going to be the answer.
Okay, we have about time for one more question. I think you were next, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Michael Evans, Johnson Space Center. Johnson Space Center has funded me to build a prototype of this superconductivity energy using magnetic energy storage. It's radical. It's not chemical batteries. It's not nuclear. It's trying to take advantage of the cryogenic environment. I have no idea if this is going to work. This is something we're just funding as a way out there TRL level 2. It's been in research ever since the 70s. I mean, my colleagues at the University of Houston have been publishing on this. Have any of you ever looked at any of this novel technology that is not following the traditional battery or the nuclear source for energy storage? Because I'd love to piggyback on any experience any of you have as we're just trying to build an initial prototype of this.
So I'm just curious, what kind of, let's say, energy storage density, specific energy are you talking about?
For this, we're going to be at the milliwatt level. For, my goal of this project is just to demonstrate we can do something like this for a 14-day period and put some energy in it, store it, and have something at the end of 14 days to get out. The joy of it is it seems to be easily scalable, but until somebody builds a prototype and actually measures it, we don't know. Theoretically is one thing, building a physical hardware prototype is another thing. I just have not found anyone who's ever gone outside in the box like you guys. You guys are all pretty much in the box still. I'm looking for somebody who's got some experience working way outside this stuff to see if there's anybody who has someone I can talk to as we're going through this.
So I'll try and answer. I'm from STMD, and we're supposed to be, helping you guys along with these advanced technologies, and there's a limited budget for that. But I would suggest to you that do your experiment, prove that the technology is viable, and when you do it, you'll become part of the box, and we'd be happy to utilize systems that you've proven in the lab that can work and meet the mission requirements that we're proposing.
We're hopeful. But
okay.
It is radical. I just didn't know if anybody with more experience in the traditional world had ever played with it.
RB has funded some SMES also.
Did you ever build anything?
That project happened in like 2009 to 12, which is before my time at the agency. So feel free to come talk to me or info, and I can.
Sure, if anybody has influence, I'm open to it. You do it in the room because we're playing with this new thing.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't get that other question up. One topic that didn't get up was power beaming. Was that what your question was going to be about, Gary? I feel like we're going to go a minute after, Andy.
Actually, it relates to power beaming because that's one piece of the puzzle. We've heard a lot about individual pieces of the tech, but the reality of the situation is any substantive power system that's going to be implemented is going to be a layered one, okay, that is going to have your power generation, your transmission, your distribution, your controls, and your loads, okay? And until we actually start working through that end-to-end system, seeing what the pieces are that we have in our toolkits, we're not quite working the real problem yet.
That's a great point. Any of the panelists want to comment on that?
I would say it depends on the specific mission. So certainly on the human side of things, which is much more complex, I agree. Maybe some of those full system trades are still have to be fleshed out. But certainly at a spacecraft level, those are items that have been grappled with and dealt with, I'd say in a pretty significant way.
Well, a classic example with this, if you want to enable a bunch of commercial rovers for assay work and other forms of exploration, find a way to provide them power and comm, the two hardest things that they've got to deal with, and you have dramatically reduced their risk. Has anybody brought that to the table? We had one example from a previous question, offering up the example maybe the government could get involved with an RTG capability, but the reality of the situation, what's enabling? Okay, we need to know what the science needs in terms of the instruments, in terms of their requirements. We've got to be able to lay out the systems that can actually meet those for whoever the customers end up being, which is going to be a mixture of, it's this notion of a cislunar marketplace, an ecosystem of not just state actors, but commercial entities, nonprofits, universities, some irrationally perhaps exuberant billionaires, individuals that bring special insights to the table. That's going to be the ecosystem that either makes this stuff work, or we go through yet another cycle.
So, just two comments in reaction to that. I would say that yes, it is factoring into our thinking that managing risk for certainly human operations, but also science operations as we're into an extended campaign is going to be part of the equation that power can help to solve. And when we talk about managing risk for power, I think we're talking about building robust systems, robust capabilities. I spoke specifically on nuclear, but I think we would want to look to an architecture that included not just nuclear components, both fission and RPS, but also solar batteries, other potentially more exotic forms of energy storage or energy production, or provide a very robust power capability to enable this sustained campaign. And if I may address your question about the public-private partnerships, one of the things that I was remiss to mention in my opening slides, and I thought it might come up in the Q&A session, but one of the things that we're trying to do within NASA is address perhaps the regulatory and policy hurdles that may be perceived right now to using nuclear power and radioisotope power for commercial operations and commercial missions. And part of that is working with OSTP and the policymakers to make sure that as we look at policy reform and perhaps process improvement for launch approval and environmental policy compliance, we factor in the need to support commercial operations. And I think that that's coming. It's something that's being actively worked, and we likely will hear more about those types of policy changes in the next year.
And that's one interesting example. Lee mentioned the power beaming stuff. Turns out, if you push the frequencies higher, it is absolutely transformative in terms of the energy densities that you can get at from going from 36 gigahertz to 95 gigahertz, if you can get there, increases your energy density by over an order of magnitude, and reduces your rectenna size by an order of magnitude. Arguably something that could make a real difference. And we're not going to be bringing quadruple aught wire, folks, copper wire to the moon. Okay, we've got to work the different angles and find a way to orchestrate the system. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for your comment.
I think we have to conclude now. Let's give a hand of applause.
Okay, thank you very much, Lee and the panel. We had planned a break, so we'll have a short break now. Stretch your legs, but please try to come back around 2:20, and we'll start up again for the